Let the Sun Shine In is written and directed by French auteur Claire Denis, and it stars Juliette Binoche, Xavier Beauvois, Nicolas Duvauchelle, many other pretty well-known French actors, and there's a little cameo appearance in the end by the legendary Gérard Depardieu. The synopsis is fairly simple. It follows the tribulation of Juliette Binoche's character, who's a 50-something artist, single. She's divorced, or if she never got married, she's no longer with the man with whom she has had a child. And she's just going from lover to lover in search of love. And it's just this very simple story about middle-aged love and about trying to pursue love and romanticism past a certain age. It's a very light, breezy, easy watch. Not something I was expecting, actually, from a director whose body of work I'm not super familiar with. I've only seen a couple of her films. But everything that I've seen prior to this has been way heavier. And this was very light, very easy, very breezy. It reminded me of second-tier Woody Allen comedies, not the great films that he's made, maybe, but certainly had some of that urban, adult, light comedy vibes. It's constructed in a way that's very episodic. It sort of flows from sequence to sequence that are heavily dialogued, co-written actually by Claire Denis and also Christine Angot, who is a French novelist. And the dialogue is actually very sharp, very witty, very smart. But as a whole, I'm not really sure that it works in a very cohesive manner. Like I said, it feels very episodic. From what I understand, it was made in between two longer and more intensive shoots. Denis' next film is actually a sci-fi film that needs a lot of prep, that's probably going to take a lot of time. And this felt like something very simple that they could throw together with some really talented actors, and she had access to all these amazing French actors and thought, you know, I have this outline, I'm going to write dialogue with my co-writer, and we're just going to shoot this quickly and make a quick, simple, easy, light film. I will say the film and Juliette Binoche's character is able to walk this very fine line between being super charming and very watchable, but also kind of annoying and almost adolescent and immature. What I mean by that is that you have this main character who's in her 50s, and all these characters that are in their 50s, that are in their 60s, but that are treating relationships and love in a very almost adolescent, very, you could say, naive, but also pretty immature manner. And I'm sure for some people, it's going to venture onto that side of, wow, I can't stand these people, grow the fuck up. And this just may be a testament to what a wonderful actress Juliette Binoche is. I mean, you're not learning anything there. She's one of the greatest living actors, not just working in France, but in the world. And she did it for me. She was really able to exist sort of in that state of, well, sometimes I'm kind of annoyed at her, but sometimes I really find her kind of charming, and that naivete that's there, it really isn't distracting, and you know, I don't have this urge to sort of shake her and say, just stop sleeping around with these married men. Of course you're unhappy. There's no way they keep telling you they're never gonna leave their wives for you, and you keep falling for them and being sad, and there's a point where you need to wake up and you sort of need to grow up, because it's kind of pathetic. There's no point where I really felt like that, although I could see myself leaning towards that direction, which is why I think the film just exists in that sort of in-between really nicely. In terms of thematic elements, what I really read the film as was this very light critique, this small disillusion with this generation's sort of philosophy, the post-1968 sort of view of the world. For a little bit of context, in France in 1968, there was an uprising, you could say. There was a bunch of marches and a bunch of students that rioted against a country, a government that was very conservative, very religious, very authoritarian. I mean, you have to remember that at that time in France, you had just one television channel, you had just one radio channel, and they were all government controlled. So even though it was a democracy, it was a very tightly knit, closed democracy, and like I said, it was a very conservative society. And so the grand myth of 1968 is that it completely liberated morality. It was sort of our hippie revolution, summer of love revolution in a way, but then obviously that generation got older and they got wealthier and they started owning property and having kids, and in a way they sort of perpetrated a lot of the conservative and older ways of life that they were rebelling against, but definitely it opened up morality in terms of sexual freedom and in terms of the way you raise your kids, for sure. But what I found interesting in the film was I really saw it as a critique of that generation, not in a moralizing way well, of course, you're all miserable because how can you live like this by sleeping around with all these married men and, just accepting that we all have lovers and mistresses and whatnot. Of course you're all miserable and it's ridiculous. The film wasn't moralizing. It felt more like it was written from the perspective of women that were of that age, that had lived through that, and that had gone through all the simple dissolutions of life, that when you're 20, you see life and relationships in a certain way, and by the time you hit 50, things are way more complicated than you anticipated. So in that sort of analysis of that French bourgeois artistic world where they're kind of all sleeping with each other, where they all work and know each other, so it has this little weird incestuous vibe. And as someone who is essentially of the generation that is their children, I find, and this is maybe purely anecdotal evidence, that we grew up more conservative, actually, in terms of sexuality, and that certainly growing up, it felt like it wasn't as prevalent or as normal for people to, sleep around when you were in a committed relationship or things like that. Or, a lot of foreigners have this fantasy of topless women at French beaches, but nobody of my generation really goes topless at a beach. Like, the only topless women you'll see at a beach today are in their 60s, and they all have saggy, leathery tits because they were overexposed to the sun. Whether that's purely anecdotal, whether that's because I'm not from that bourgeois Parisian artistic world. I grew up more in the countryside, and I grew up mostly actually in the United States and in Ireland, and not so much in France. But then when I moved to France, I was on a coastal city. I was more in the countryside. So really not surrounded by those types of people, by those types of mentalities, for sure. But of the anecdotal evidence, again, that I've gathered in my life and in living in larger cities and in living in Paris, was that I certainly found that people my age weren't as open, certainly. And that doesn't stop us from being just as miserable as the generations before us. And maybe that's just because they were in their mid-20s, and by the time they hit 50 and 60, all of their illusions about maybe a more monogamous, more traditional family statute will have totally disappeared. So essentially there you have it. Like I said, it's a very light, breezy, easy film. It's crisp and sweet like a summer rosé. It's delicious while you're sipping it, but will it last? Will you be thinking about it when the end of the year comes around and it's time to think about the best films of the year? I'm really not sure. There's a really great scene, though, that I think has stayed with me certainly for now, and that I think will stay with me for a long time, which is that last scene, the last dialogue between Depardieu and Juliette Binoche, where you have these two powerhouses of French cinema. That scene really steals the show for me and is a great way to end the film. A lot of great, dry comedic value to be derived from there. And it's just a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to talk about Claire Denis. Like I said, I'm not super well-versed in her filmography. I've only seen a couple, but everything I've seen from her has been pretty remarkable and always super interesting, super original. She is certainly one of the most interesting, the most talented directors working from France, and she really isn't a household name. I mean, she is in like a tiny little portion of the population. Her next film is a sci-fi film with Robert Pattinson, and obviously there you have a named actor, an international actor, and that's going to open some doors, open some possibilities for some wider distribution. But also, he's a guy that, because of the Twilight films, has an immense following, and his fan base is, I guess you could say, dedicated, to be polite, maybe a little obsessive, but if you want some retweets and some likes, just tweet about Robert Pattinson and you'll see your Twitter just blow up, because they are dedicated. And there will maybe people watching this video that'll be thinking, well, I mean, what are you talking about? Claire Denis, she's like one of the most well-known auteurs out there, and I guarantee you that that is within a tiny little portion of the population. Even in France, I don't think she gets the recognition she deserves. I'm not really sure where this film is being distributed. Unfortunately, I feel like I'm talking about a film that none of you out there are going to be able to see unless you're in a French territory, or maybe if you're in LA or New York in certain film festivals, but maybe it'll hit some VOD services at a certain point. But I just felt it would be nice to focus my time not on a film with CGI dinosaurs and exploding volcanoes, but rather on a really talented filmmaker that is working in my home country. And yeah, no dinosaurs in this one unless you want to count Gérard Depardieu, which you probably should. So as always, thanks very much for watching the video. Be sure to hit the like button if you like the review. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing, because watching the subscriber number go up is my personal interior sunshine that lights up my day and makes me feel needed and wanted and happy.